The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. It's fair to say that this game has a fair amount of controversy around it, as fans either seem to think that the game is crap or the crack. So today, we're here to take a look at my stupid opinions on Skyward Sword.
It seems like no one really has a clear idea of what they want the Zelda game to look like. When Wind Waker first came out, it got bashed for being too cartoony and kiddie, while Twilight Princess was praised for its dark and gritty adult visual style. Nowadays, it's pretty clear in my mind which game holds up and which game doesn't, and I think the stylized look of Wind Waker will always be the kind that stands up to stand the test of time. How does Skyward Sword look? Well, it depends. This game didn't go for a set stylized look in the same vein as a game like Wind Waker per se, but there is a certain amount of stylistic choices that made the graphics of this game stand out in certain parts. The coolest stylistic element in just the general presentation of Skyward Sword has to definitely be the decision to make the visuals often resemble that of a watercolor painting, especially when looking at certain areas from afar. The way it all kind of blurs together is very reminiscent of this style, and it works for the game it's attached to pretty well. Seeing areas from the sky allows you to see the obvious use of this style on several occasions, and certain set pieces within the game also contribute to this. That said, the game isn't too stylized for the most part, often looking like a typical Zelda game for the time it was released up close. It doesn't try to be particularly dark or particularly kid-friendly, but instead reaches more of a happy medium. While I think maybe an even more stylized look based in watercolor might have helped the game's visuals overall, the game still looks pretty good. It also shouldn't be understated that sometimes the overall presentation can become an enthralling experience that can drive emotion forward or draw you in just from the way certain scenes are presented. Some good examples of this are when first encountering Fi, completing a dungeon, or entering a secret realm, which came to be some of my favorite parts of the game. Key parts in the story are certainly presented in a cinematic way that will pull you in, and this is thanks in no small part to the fully orchestrated music. I don't find this soundtrack to be necessarily the best in the Zelda franchise, holding less generally iconic and memorable tunes as a game like Ocarina of Time. The music often goes for a more atmospheric approach to fit the scene, but moments where the music stands out are certainly memorable, as songs like Ballad of the Goddess and Fi's Gratitude really manage to evoke emotion, as well as being highly memorable. I'd like to see more Zelda games incorporate fully orchestrated music, as I think an even better soundtrack could be made in a similar style. All of this said, this experience culminates into one prominent attribute. This is by far the most cinematic Zelda game to date, and will oftentimes pull you in through the way it tells the game's story. But changing the Zelda formula in favor of a more cinematic direction actually made the game feel a bit lacking for me, in keeping to some of the Nintendo traditions like lack of voice acting. This has been the only Zelda game where I've actually wanted voice acting. Skyward Sword's presentation as a whole is frequently enthralling, cinematic, and captivating, but a lack of clearly defined stylistic choices and not going far enough into taking risks in a cinematic direction put it just shy of greatness. As I said, this game goes for a far more cinematic and captivating experience than any Zelda game to date. What this means for the story is a lot of things. Notably, it changes the dynamic between characters in interesting new ways, and takes the story into a direction that feels much less like a retelling, but a truly suitable, enthralling origin story for the whole Zelda universe. In terms of characters, we have the dynamic between Link and Zelda. This has already been explored in some fantastic videos on the game, which I'll go ahead and link here because I'm lazy. I'll link the videos. Link. Okay, I'll shut up. Another surprise character that makes their way into the game is the unlikely Groose. While I don't want to give away too many spoilers here, I will say that this is one of the few places in the Zelda universe where we actually get to see real true character development, and it's fantastic. The story as a whole is accented in effect by the way it presents itself. Despite following the Zelda trope of following the hero's journey, The characters have well-crafted and believable relationships, and the story is not only interesting in how it's presented, but is also sure to take you on some emotional twists and turns. Basically, this is the best Zelda game to date as far as story and characters are concerned, at least in my mind, and this shouldn't be understated. It does leave some things somewhat unclear as far as the origin story is concerned, and the final boss seems very open to interpretation. The villains in general aren't as well developed as, say, Ganondorf and Ocarina of Time, which I may go into some other day. That said, we do have Girahim, who makes several appearances throughout the game, and is just generally quite fabulous. One last question I pose is this: why does everyone hate Fi? I find her to be fairly captivating in how she's presented, interesting, and her constant use of calculations and factual information to just be kind of her character. I feel this was done intentionally, and the noises she makes aren't really annoying or obnoxious like Navi's are. She has a cool design and can make certain scenes in the game really fascinating, and her mention of obvious facts don't generally get too out of hand. Just my 2 cents. And here we have the area in which this game is absolutely hated upon with a burning passion by half of the fanbase. In a way, the gameplay of this game might very well be a swan song for the entire system it's on. Does innovation and fun for a lot of people outweigh another large population that finds motion controls to be gimmicky trash? Is limiting the enjoyment of your core audience worth it if a lot of your audience still enjoys the experience? I don't think there's an easy answer for this, especially for the little gem of a game we have here. It hurts because they clearly tried to make the best experience they could using the Wii's hardware. That was clearly the mindset going into the making of this game. Utilize the Wii. The game calls for a lot of precision based on the motion controls, a form of control that doesn't offer that much precision from the get-go. The fact that this game requires Wii Motion Plus should be pretty telling of this, and the number of people that still struggled with the controls seems to suggest that it would have been a lot easier to make just a normal game with a controller and buttons. Does feeling like an epic sword fighter for some justify frustration for others? I tend to lean towards a resounding no. As much as I want to like this gameplay, as much as this was what I wanted when I was a young lad seeing the Wii for the first time, the design frequently just feels unintuitive to me. It's not even just in the combat, but the fact that they require you to use motion controls for the menus, the items, to equip your freaking shield. I understand the gameplay choice for the combat, it just seems unnecessarily frustrating for everything else. And of course, the combat is frequently frustrating too, the Wii Remote frequently getting desynced or something, I don't know. Just freaking work, hit the goddamn... Yeah, I was one of the ones that didn't really enjoy this game's gameplay. And once again, that speaks to the choices made and how this gameplay was designed. And of course, the game's enemies don't do it any favors, requiring a lot of precision and being pretty annoying to deal with. The simple ability to turn off motion controls, especially for areas like the game's menus, would have enhanced the gameplay a lot for a huge portion of the people that played it. But that speaks to the system itself, doesn't it? The focus on motion controls over a normal controller led to a lot of games and gamers having to work around this design choice, and making it harder to control a lot of games. As much as I do love the Wii, it's no wonder why the system can be so controversial among gamers. And this leaves Skyward Sword as a bit of a swan song for the system as a whole. The overworld in Zelda is perhaps one of the most essential parts in every single game, and it has been from the beginning. The first Zelda launched with a world full of secrets that you had to explore for yourself. It connected every dungeon in whatever order you wanted, making it an almost open world experience, or at least as close as you can get on an 8-bit console. Then came Zelda 2, and unfortunately with a term I'll deem world-breaking. Yeah, that's not a real term. Put that in the game design dictionary, guys. World-breaking confirmed. Basically, an overworld that breaks immersion by taking you out of the world it's set in jarringly, like in a game like Zelda 2. Rather than flowing from one area to the next all within the same world, there's just sort of a drastic shift. Games like Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker do a great job at giving you an overworld to explore that doesn't break immersion like this in a 3D space. What is taken away is some of the truly explorative and open world aspects found within the original Zelda, in favor of more linear dungeon progression. But the overworld is still present and mostly open to the player, even if a lot of what you can do in it may be secretly walled off by how far you are in the game. What's cool about this is that as you come to each new area, you want to try things. The game encourages you to explore a massive overworld without breaking immersion, and offers enough secrets and things you can do with the amount of abilities you have at the time to be interesting. Skyward Sword, while interesting in concept with the overworld of the sky, unfortunately somewhat fails on some of these fronts. There's a bit of a disconnect that develops as the game's overworld is almost completely isolated from the areas you visit in the majority of your experience playing. What makes this disconnect even more apparent is the fact that the worlds below the wonders of the sky almost act as mini overworlds of their own. The game has you backtracking through each of these areas and experiencing them in new ways, all within the same world outside of the sky. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but taking away a massive overworld in favor of these individual worlds to explore can be a somewhat odd approach in just having the sky overworld at all. Upon first entering the sky, it may feel almost like the game has potential for a Wind Waker-like sense of exploration. It's one of the few parts of the game I actually consider fun to control. It has cool music, and islands floating in the distance capture the imagination of what could be out there. Suffice to say, I ended up pretty disappointed. If anything, the sky is incredibly closed off but for a few areas, and it hardly interacts with the world below. The game doesn't center on the sky, it centers on what's underneath the sky. It has you backtracking through these areas, exploring these miniature worlds again and again. You get the point. This said, it does have one of the best hub areas existent in the Zelda universe in Skyloft, which is actually pretty cool. What I'll say is this disconnect between the sky and the ground makes sense for the story-driven game they were going for. It does a good job at transforming its world in interesting ways. I just can't help but find myself somewhat disappointed by how closed off and small it all feels. And I wish they had kept the world direction to the sky in the same vein as Wind Waker kept it to the sea. Skyward Sword is a beautiful game plagued by some glaring poor choices in its design. While on one hand we have a Zelda game that does story, characters, and enthralling cinematic sequences better than any other in the series to date, on the other we have a very closed off world with a style of gameplay that's fundamentally flawed. Little elements like lack of voice acting, a more atmospheric approach to the music, and having a world that feels very closed off don't always do the game justice. And the controls can be entirely frustrating, the enemy design also of course not doing it any justice. For all the problems this game has, it seems like something about the story, the characters, the presentation, or just how it can sometimes feel to play it, chimes in to remind you that for all this game does poorly, it also does something right. Suffice to say, I came out of this experience with very mixed feelings. I think Skyward Sword is a game worth playing and worth forming your own opinion on. I don't feel like it's an experience you're necessarily going to love, but that doesn't mean it's one you have to hate either. So I'll leave it up to you to form your own opinion on. After all, I've been giving mine for the past 15 minutes, haven't I? I hope you enjoyed. Peace!